person watching my video, we're going to be taking my friend here, Huck, to Tampa for the first time. You've never been to the Southeast or flown in a small aircraft before, is that correct?
Correct.
That's correct. You can check out his channel. I'll definitely be putting that in the description. Very interesting stuff. So right now we're just waiting for the engine to warm up back in the Piper Arrow. It takes a little bit when it's this cold outside. And once it's warmed up, we'll do the run-up and then depart for Tampa. We'll be going instrument, and it should be quite interesting. Greenville ground, Aero November 32196, south ramp, requesting IFR Lima, Charlie, Quebec, information Romeo.
Aero 32196, Greenville ground, cleared to the Lima, Charlie, Quebec Airport as filed. Initially turn right heading 030, maintain 3000, expect 6010 minutes after your departure. Departure is Greer, 118.8, squawk 2065.
Number 32196, turn runway 15 heading 030, maintain 3000, clear for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff, runway 1, fly heading 030, maintain 3000, Aero November 32196. You're going to hear the propeller surge for a second. There it is. Full throttle set. Oil pressure and temperature are in the green. Airspeed indicator is alive. 60 knots. 70 knots, rotate. And 85 set. Insufficient runway, gear coming up.
Street 5175, contact Atlanta Center 135.35, good day.
There you go, 150 miles per hour or so over the ground. It's not as fast as that airliner you took over, but it's nice.
Well, point the field and weather. 331, Fox Rescue.
A few more clouds and then we'll be out. Pretty cool.
Southwest 5041, descend and maintain 16,000, altimeter for Tampa 303.
There's dot above. So, airspeed's below 130, gear coming down. Gear and transit light on. You can feel the landing gear as the plane jerks a little bit. Gear and transit light off. 3 green, no red. Gear is down and locked.
Tower 196, when your speed permits, make a 180 on the runway and back taxi to a right turn on taxiway Charlie.
Roger, we'll make a 180 and back taxi to Charlie, 32196. Alright. I haven't received this clearance in a while. That's kind of fun.
Due to limited storage and battery space on the GoPro, we only recorded the leg from Greenville to Lake City. After refueling in Lake City, we continued to Peter a night in Tampa, and from there proceeded to Kissimmee, had a good time in that area, Orlando, and then returned to Greenville. It was that return flight to Greenville where things did not quite go according to plan.
Very much so, yeah.
Very much so. For this video, we were hoping for a nice relaxing IFR flight from Greenville to Tampa, and that is what we got on the cameras. Starting with the pre-flight inspection, one of the things we check is the oil level. The engine in the Piper Arrow is supposed to have 6 quarts in it before you take off, but due to a maintenance issue, the oil pressure relief was dumping oil out of the engine and just making quite a mess. So the mechanic recommended that instead of filling it to 6 quarts like we normally did, we take it down to 4 quarts, treat that 4 as 6. It's still well within limits for what the engine can run on, but it minimized that issue of the oil being spit out and making a mess for the flight school to clean up. So leaving Kissimmee, I saw the oil was at about 4.4 quarts, a little below 4.5. That was getting a little bit low for the flight back to Greenville, another 4 hours. I did not want to add any oil to the 4.4s, but the flight school has a policy that we must add a whole quart to the engine if we add any. So that would have brought the oil level up to 5.4, which was a bit too much. So given the option of being at 4.4 quarts or 5.4 quarts, if I added that 1 quart, I elected to stick with the 4.4, since the 5 definitely would have spit out all that oil. So in the previous few flights, based on the oil burn that we had been seeing, that 4.4 should have been more than enough to make it back to Greenville. During the run-up, that oil pressure was in the green, solidly. After takeoff and slightly into cruise, it began to creep down very slowly. It was still at the top end of the yellow, but it was definitely in the caution range, which is not too much of an issue. I've seen that plane do that before, even on a previous flight. So I wasn't concerned yet, but it had gone down some, and I mentioned to Huck that we should definitely be keeping an eye on that. And that was still well within limits, so we continued the flight as usual. A little farther into the flight, maybe a little over an hour in, we saw that it had dropped just a little bit more, so I went ahead and had Huck take a picture. And what did you see at this point?
We were very solidly in the yellow. Like, you got the words oil and pressure, and the far side of the indicator was right in line with the P for the oil pressure. So that was kind of the reference that we were using, but we also wanted to take a picture so that way we'd have like a very objective measure of it later.
Exactly. So when you are noticing that something is not quite where you want it to be, situation is not quite as ideal as you would like, pick something objective. Have a threshold where you say, if this parameter falls below this value or gets into this place, now I'm going to do whatever action. In this case, I had decided that from my perspective in the right seat of the plane, if I saw that needle fall to where it was over the O in oil pressure, and keep in mind because I'm in the right seat, it's way off, so it would have been far, far higher than that point. But just from my perspective, that is where I would start seeking out alternative options, such as landing early. That is a far safer way of making decisions, especially in aviation, as opposed to saying, well, I think things are okay, it might get better. No. That is a very, very dangerous way to make decisions. Don't do that. So even just an hour and 20 minutes into the flight, we had a plan in place. And the issue was still more than fine, and we were just keeping an eye on it, so that if it did develop any worse, we could take appropriate actions. Fast forward another 45 minutes into the flight, and Huck took another picture so we could compare it to the first. Oil pressure had changed very little between those times. Now, an hour and 15 minutes after that first picture, we took a third. And what were you saying in this third picture?
It had a considerable drop from where it was, and given the rate at which it was descending, when we went from the second picture to the third picture, that was when we saw a very noticeable change in a very short period of time.
So putting those pictures on the screen, hour 15 minutes into the flight, not bad. Another 35, 45 minutes later, still just fine, oil pressure where it needs to be. But then just 40 minutes after that, it had dropped a lot. So plotting this on a rough chart, you can see the rate at which it had dropped was quite extreme in this last 40 minutes. It was at this point that I realized we needed to land. We were over Augusta, Georgia, but the problem was that it was solid overcast over the area, and I did not want to attempt an instrument approach in an engine that was very obviously leaking out oil. The risk being that we would have the aircraft in the clouds, the engine fail, and now we have an engine failure in instrument conditions, which is a very, very dangerous situation to be in. So I elected to continue the flight to Greenwood, South Carolina. That's only 30 miles shorter than going all the way to Greenville, but I knew that there were visual conditions there and it probably would have been safer. After making this decision, I advised Augusta approach that we were changing our destination to Greenwood. It soon became time to begin our descent, so we advised that we were descending. I thought to myself, well, now that we're descending, maybe I could attempt to minimize the damage to the engine by decreasing the RPM. So I grabbed that little blue lever that controls the propeller, and I pulled it back gently. The idea there was this will send a little bit of the oil from the engine into the propeller and increase that blade angle so that the engine turns at a lower speed. My thoughts being minimizing damage from lack of oil. So I told you the oil pressure is going to drop a little bit, but it'll come right back up because every other time I pulled back that blue lever, the oil pressure did go down, but then it came right back up. So that's what I did. As I pulled that lever back, oil pressure went down and it did not come back up. And now it was very bad.
And at that point, we were solidly in the red.
In the red. So I thought to myself, I don't care about engine longevity right now. I just want the engine to run. So pushing that prop lever all the way back forward, I thought that'll definitely bring all that oil back to the engine and fix the oil pressure issue, at least temporarily. It did not. The oil pressure remained solidly below the red line at this point. So that's where I went. Augusta approach, Aero November 32196. We're going to cancel IFR and land at a different airport at this point. Thank you for your help today, as cheerfully as I could, because I did not want to have to deal with their questions. Looking back, was it an emergency situation? Yeah, probably. But in the moment, I did not have the mental resources to make that decision. I saw that there was an airport a little to the left of us on the GPS, and I was going to land at that airport. I didn't need anything else getting in the way of making that happen. And considering that it was an uncontrolled airport, no control tower, declaring an emergency would not have helped very much. This random but very helpfully placed little airport just happened to be McCormick, South Carolina, and that's where we made our emergency landing. After that, I switched over to the advisory frequency for the airport so I could tell any other aircraft using that airport what we were doing. And so I pulled the power all the way back to idle, throttle lever all the way back, and we were basically a glider at that point. Yes, the engine was still working, but I had decided that the engine is probably going to fail, so I want to fly this plane in such a way that if it were to fail, it would not affect anything. So I judged and timed the approach into this airport so that we were gliding the whole way down. There was one point where the altitude was looking a little bit lower than I wanted it to be, so I bumped up the throttle just slightly to push us back up to where I had a comfortable safety margin. The engine did that, it gave us the power we needed, and I pulled it back to idle, and I never touched it the rest of the way down. It was only about 8 minutes from the time we first began that descent towards Greenwood that we were on the ground. Now, going through this descent, the engine began to do some strange things.
Even though I'm not an aeronautical individual, and it's having a difficult time regulating its rhythm, and so that's what started happening. We were out of options, right? We had nothing that we could do to try and fix that.
No, not at all. So that situation is what is referred to as surging. The best example of this I can give is when we first go to add takeoff power on a runway. When the throttle is pushed up to maximum, the engine begins to speed up, and there comes a point where it's going to get to where it would go past its red line, it would overspeed. So it is at that point that the governor kicks in, and that's where the blade angle starts increasing to bring that RPM back down, basically like a car shifting into a higher gear when the RPM gets too high. But the problem was this was not takeoff. The engine was doing it uncommanded, repeatedly, and I'll try to play a clip of takeoff in this repetitive nature to demonstrate the kind of thing that our engine was doing at this point. Because the engine and propeller are governed by oil pressure, it was this surging that told me the engine definitely did not have enough oil. Although I had not seen a rise in oil temperature, there may have been a very slight one, but it was quite minimal. It was clear that that engine did not have the proper oil to run. Pulling the power back to idle seemed to minimize this surging problem. And so the engine never actually failed. We touched down at McCormick just fine, taxied off the runway, and shut down. We of course called the flight school immediately after, and they sent another aircraft out to get us, which was very nice.
Given everything that could have gone wrong and everything like that, the fact that we touched down and you called and there was another aircraft like in the air just minutes after we touched down. Big kudos to Greenville Aviation.
So when our replacement aircraft got there, they switched with us and took the Piper Arrow for maintenance. They actually put 3 quarts of oil into it. After we had shut the engine down while waiting for that new aircraft to come, we had seen that it had about 3 quarts of oil left in it, so now they had 6, which was more than enough to get it through the short hop to where maintenance could be performed. Examination by the mechanic revealed that the engine had cracked. There was a large crack in the crank casing, and that's where all that oil had dumped out. Apparently that crank casing was new and even under warranty, and it's one of those situations where there's nothing you can do. I don't say this to scare people away from flying, but it is important to know that there are some things that are outside of our control, and that's why we train. This is the point of training for engine failures, so that when these freak events do happen, we know how to respond safely and get the aircraft on the ground safely. You can do all the right things.
The whole point of the video, right?
Whole point of the video.
Risk management, how to prepare for an emergency.
Looking back over this whole sequence of events, there was no single moment where you could say, well, that person did that bad, or I did this bad in this exact spot. No, it was a series of decisions that each made sense in their own way, and it all built up to just this perfect storm that resulted in a pretty bad day. But that said, that day could have been a whole lot worse. And even though things did go very wrong, they still went very right in a lot of ways. One of the best ways to analyze a situation like this, I think, is a tool provided by the FAA, oddly enough. It is called the DECIDE model. Detect, estimate, choose, identify, do, evaluate. Those are the steps that we go through. No, I didn't actually go through those steps in the air, but because we practice this decision-making process on the ground, it trains your mind so that you approximately follow the steps while you're in the air and lead to much safer decision-making. So let's go through this. First, detect. That's part of a standard instrument scan. When you're flying, you can't just be sitting there staring straight ahead or, oh look, pretty clouds. No, you need to be doing a scan, looking at through the instruments. It was during one of these scans where I saw that oil pressure, and we kept an eye on it. Another part of that detection step is documenting. Actually looking at the very specific value that this oil pressure, in our case, is at, and is it going to stay there? Is it going to continue to get worse? And using that to make more definitive decisions. One of the best examples I can give for having a very defined cutoff is the takeoff briefing. When you are doing a takeoff, you should have a point on that runway that you've selected a parameter and a point. If this parameter is not met at this point, we are aborting the takeoff. On a short runway, it might be when I'm passing this tree or this taxiway, I need to be at rotation speed. For some of these longer runways like we were using, it is when I'm halfway down this runway, this plane needs to be in the air. If it does not meet this parameter, if it's not in the air or not at rotation speed at the point I've picked, we're aborting the takeoff, pulling power all the way back and hitting the brakes. We'll have a mechanic look at the plane because something is definitely wrong. By going on wishful thinking, especially during a takeoff, thinking that, yeah, things are looking okay, the plane's still accelerating, it'll probably be in the air by the time we make it to the end of the runway. No, that is an extremely dangerous way to make decisions. Having that definitive point, an objective cutoff to make that decision for you so you don't leave any room for bias. When I first detected that oil pressure had fallen just slightly into the yellow, well, that wasn't a very big deal. And that brings us on to the E, which is estimate. Estimate possible outcomes. When that oil pressure was still just barely in the yellow, the outcomes were quite reasonable. Continue to the destination, very low risk of failure, or land immediately and deal with an issue that's quite minor and I've seen before. At that point, it made sense to continue the flight as per usual. It's when that oil pressure went even lower. Well, now I saw that this outcome of continuing safely to Greenville is becoming less and less likely, and the whole engine possibly failing and needing to divert was becoming more likely. Next is C, choose. So I chose one of those outcomes. As I said before, I chose to go with continuing the flight, but when that oil pressure was getting seriously low, that is when I chose to land early. And maybe we don't make the time frame that we'd planned out and are late, but sometimes that's the best thing you can do is go for the less risky choice, accept the risks that make sense, don't continue the flight if it's not looking like that can be done safely. Next, identify steps to make that happen. So when I decided to divert, I looked at the GPS, saw that McCormick, South Carolina was a little off to our left. So we need to turn left, we need to continue this descent and do it very rapidly. This engine's not looking good. I need to make sure that I'm prepared for an engine failure and don't put myself in a position where I really need that engine. Well, these are some of the steps. Next, do those steps, that's what I did. But then this last step, evaluate, is extremely important. Go back and look over yourself. Are these steps that I'm taking actually working? In my case, they were, but there was one point where I was a little bit lower than I was comfortable with. And so it is there where I added a little bit of power to the engine, because the engine was still working. So let's use the resources available to us and keep us in a position where we're safe. And had the engine not responded, that might have been bad, but I still don't think we were at any risk because I caught it early and got us back to an altitude where we needed to be very, very easily with a minimal change. But that's the critical part of that evaluate step. There may come a point in flying where even the outcome doesn't work, and that was what happened. The first outcome I had chosen was to continue to Greenville. But as the problem progressed, I needed to completely go back and re-evaluate to change that outcome to a diversion instead. So it shows how this is a very dynamic way of making decisions. There's a lot that goes into it. And I've found that this decide model is a very good way of going through a decision-making process. So I encourage you, if you have any stories, if you've had any weird situations in aviation, or even just driving or anything else for that matter, go through that decide model. See if you were making decisions in a logical, methodical way, and it might just help. A reason for continuing to an airport with better conditions is to avoid a situation where I had multiple critical problems stacking up all at once. Because in an emergency situation, task management is critical, making sure that you are not overloading what your mind can do, and keeping the number of tasks that one is juggling as manageable as possible, because it's already stressful enough.
You know, like I said, I'm not an aviation person. I'm not a pilot. I'm not an aviation student. So I have no idea some of the complexities of this. But when we were talking about this previously, 100%, clear visibility and no wind, and it's already hard enough to land. Now you add in some clouds, you add in a little bit of extra weather, or some wind, and it's already getting more complicated. You're also trying to deal with this, engine issue, right? Because there's all sorts of factors there as well. You're trying not to damage the aircraft, right? So you're trying to protect the aircraft, but you're also needing to use it to protect yourself, so that way, we don't die. You're trying to toe that line, and then all of these things combined, and then you also have an idiot sitting next to you that doesn't know what's going on. And so as the pilot, you have to manage the passengers as well, because that was the other thing. Like, I didn't know how to find an airport, so I was just sitting there watching you, keeping the aircraft going while you're also trying to find an airport for us to land at. So yeah, there was a lot going on there.
That brings up an interesting point of crew resource management. You may not have been someone with any aviation experience, but you were still a member of the crew. I still could have given you a checklist and said, hey, read through this for me. And although I did not do that, I did have you looking out that I got the landing gear down. Make sure that these lights are green before we land, because that's rule number 1 of a complex aircraft. Don't land without the wheels.
It sounds so ridiculous, but when you think about, the Florida Air accident, where the crew was so focused on whether or not the landing gear bulb was out that they completely lost track of their altitude and crashed into the Everglades. And because 3 trained professionals were focused on a light bulb. Our distraction could have been just as, there's one trained professional and one knucklehead, and focusing on a very real engine issue, right? It's not a question of whether this is a problem. It is a problem. It's just how severe the problem is. That could have focused our attention, and we could have forgot to put the landing gear down.
Yeah. So definitely a legitimate concern, which is why I told you, make sure I get these 3 checks. Make sure I check it 3 times that this landing gear is down and locked before we land, and yell at me if I don't.
And, and that's the thing, is you built this habit, and so your habit isn't something that you have to think about doing. You did get your 3 checks in without even realizing it, because, you look back at it in hindsight and you said, did I get all 3 checks in? But I was keeping track, and yes, you did. You got all 3 checks. If you start with it as a habit, it just becomes part of who you are, and then you can't help but do it the right way.
Even though you've been pretty hard on yourself, it was helpful having you there. Even if I didn't have you do very much, just knowing that I had someone looking over my shoulder, even just making sure that I got those wheels down, it took a little bit of stress off of a very stressful situation, and that helped a lot. So if you can make use of your crew, I highly recommend it. Definitely helpful. At the very least, they can check for some green lights. So in light of all this, what would you say to people who would listen to this story and say, well, that's why I never fly. Definitely never flying in an airplane again.
Based on my recent experiences with, airliners and the fact that they stranded me all the way across the country, this was a manageable problem. This shouldn't be a deterrence to anybody wanting to fly, especially a small aircraft, because even though it sounds really intense and scary and horrifying, it was very manageable, as opposed to something that's really minor, like a flight being canceled, but you have absolutely no control. There's nothing you can do. If the flight's canceled and that's it, you're just done. Based on my experience from taking aircraft accident investigation and seeing all these different reports about how different things fall apart and lead to very serious mishaps, to be in the midst of something like that unfolding and then seeing it being handled properly, and not leading to a serious incident like that, you train for things to go bad. That is the whole purpose of this. You hope that every flight goes flawlessly every single time, but you have to be prepared for an emergency situation. And so to have this happen helps demonstrate that Greenville Aviation and your teaching works, because it did keep us from having a bigger problem. Like I said, somebody that doesn't know what's going on, I can't imagine a better outcome.
So to anyone who's watching, I hope this helped in your own decision making. Even not in aviation, but just picking a point where you've decided, if this happens, then I will do X. Because too often we let things progress to a point where they do become a serious problem, when we did not have that defined cutoff. Another problem might be not following through when we make a promise that we're going to do X at this point. So definitely make sure, if you decide I'm going to do something when this parameter is met, make sure you do that. It's very important. Also, just following sound judgment and logic. If things are not going according to plan, be willing to change that plan. to better accommodate the rapidly changing situation. In our case, it was landing at a different airport than we originally intended, but at the end of the day, we did get to land, and we did get to walk away from it and talk about it with no real issue, and the plane will probably fly again once they get the engine fixed. That's a pretty good outcome. So I hope this helped. I hope you enjoyed it. Definitely check out Huck Finn's channel. Link will be in the description.
Yeah, that's just a hodgepodge channel as well.
Well, we have that in common. We make random stuff. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a very nice day.